Hi, this is Mike with episode 32 of Getting Everyone Moving, brought to you by Palms to Pines Parasports. Today we have Doug Jones, who's very involved with the National Wheelchair Basketball Association. Hey, Doug.
Hey there, how are you?
Good. Hey, so how did you get involved with wheelchair basketball?
Okay. Gosh, I have to think back a long way on that. Um, I acquired my disability as a high school student, so, in 1974. So relatively shortly thereafter, I began to hear a little bit about wheelchair basketball. In fact, when I was in the hospital, acute care after the initial injury, I had a roommate who was a wheelchair basketball player who was in the hospital addressing a pressure sore. So I got a little bit of a feel that it existed, and I was like most people at that point in time, marginally interested, but a little more focused right then on just the immediacy of my current situation. So once the dust settled a little bit, and I heard a little bit more from someone else about wheelchair basketball. And I had always been a very active athlete, prior to my injury. In fact, my injury was a sports-related injury. Um, I I kind of tuned in then, and I went out to a practice or two with the Orlando Orange Wheels back then, but only a couple practices because then I went away to college in Texas. After 2 years of college in Texas, when I transferred back uh, to Florida and to the University of Florida, there was a wheelchair basketball team called the North Florida Renegades in Gainesville, Florida. So in the 1980-81 season was my first season, and and that group welcomed me out and got me started and taught me the ropes. So I got involved then, played a number of years, and then transitioned as some of us do into coaching, and then after coaching have transitioned into more of an administrative role with the NWBA.
So after you were injured, was there a period of time where you felt kind of depressed, like, what am I going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was more in a state of kind of shock and disbelief. The nature of my injury was kind of unusual. I didn't have a fracture, so even though the physicians told me that they thought it was very likely that it was a permanent injury, I didn't really believe them for the first 6 months or so, and I kept thinking, one day I'm going to wake up and my body's going to have recovered. So by the time that it had dawned on me that they knew what they were talking about, I had already started making some transitions into life as a person that was a wheelchair user. So like everybody, I'm certain I had um, days to where it was upsetting and disappointing and and all of those negative emotions. Um, but I think I was fortunate in that I moved through those maybe a little more quickly than most folks. I grew up in a family, and there was a lot of family support, which helped, but also there was no real martyrs in our family. This is, this isn't a direct quote from my mom, but I remember, her response was something to the effect of, "This is really, really an unfortunate thing that happened. Let's cry for an hour and get on with life." Um, uh, and that's an oversimplification, but I do know that I came from a very forward-looking family, so I was supported and encouraged to pay more attention to what was next than what was behind me.
Beside your family, were your friends pretty supportive of you? How did they kind of help you to, keep
Yeah,
going?
that's a really interesting question because I was actually just talking about that dynamic with one of my college roommates' nephew in the Dallas area just had a spinal cord injury, and he's 23. And among the things we chatted about on a Zoom call yesterday was this exact dynamic. And so you know, I think the challenge is this. I think many of our friends who have known us as an able-bodied person, they don't know what's the right thing to do. Okay. So there's a tendency to be polite, but to be careful. And they don't want to offend you. I remember one friend saying to me one time, "Hey, we're gonna walk. Oh, I mean, we're gonna go up to the store." And I just kind of chuckled and said, "The word walk doesn't send me into a tailspin." And but that, especially back when I was first injured, there was so little experience that people had with persons with disabilities that what was just caution in other people's minds felt like being abandoned, in maybe my mind and in people who had acquired disabilities. And you have certain things you do with your friend groups, whether it's fishing or we would go down to the sand lot and play baseball, and people don't know what you can and can't do, so they politely check in with you, but they go on with their lives. So it became my responsibility, and it took me a while to figure that out, that I needed to message my friends with a message that said, I'm not emotionally fragile. This is an adventure for me and for you. I understand that. Let's give each other a cushion to make mistakes, without it being catastrophic. And and I would like to be included, even if I just go to the sand lot and watch, or coach, or we figure out a way that I can play first base because I don't have to have as much range. Um, so sometimes we have to own the responsibility as someone with a new disability to educate our friends and make our friends comfortable. And it's not always easy because we got a lot on our plate, but the bottom line is we really need to do it because we have more to gain by continuing to be a part of a broader community rather than just retreating into a safer, smaller sphere.
Has anything ever stopped you then from, just leading a full life and doing whatever it is that you want to do with your life?
Mhm. Yeah, there's certainly things that are insurmountable obstacles here and there. Maybe if I had wanted to be a roofer, or even honestly, there may be somebody that disagrees with this, but a orthopedic surgeon, or something, that requires, um, even for someone that's pretty functionally independent and physically capable like I am, there's certain types of things that that you don't do exactly the same way. So, and I could make a laundry list of things. One of my good friends taught my kids to ride a bicycle, because they could run along beside them, you know, and little things like that are sometimes iconic in our minds. Um, Maybe hurt a little bit and are things that will cause us to feel badly about the circumstance. But if we circle back and think mostly about the bigger picture things, the ability to have a family, spouse, kids, a successful career, a good friend group, most of those very core type of things that give us happiness in our lives are available just with some types of of modifications. And I'm careful sometimes not to group every disability together, because I'm a T7 paraplegic, and I'm incomplete, and I'm pretty functional. I was single until I was 28, and actually till I was 31. I met my wife when I was 28, and I lived on my own, and took care of virtually everything I needed taken care of. Um, but I know that I'm, in the regular world may group all of us together, quadriplegics, paraplegics,
Yeah,
amputees. But the reality is someone who is a C5 quad has a different set of
right.
boundaries than a T7 paraplegic has. So, so I try and keep that in context. And for me, it's almost always been about functional independence. That's a term I like to the degree that I can be accountable and responsible for everything for myself, the better. And of course the reality is I can't on everything. If a limb falls on the roof of my house, I'm going to find one of my friends, to run up there and get it. And I'm going to try and swap out, not formally, but informally, I'm going to look for a way, can I run to the airport and pick up one of his family members when he's busy, something that trades it off. But, that ends up being kind of the sort, if I said there was two sources of occasional frustration for me, one is some of the basic tasks that an able-bodied person might be able to do that I don't. Maybe it's hanging a picture on the wall in my office, and it's a small thing, but it's annoying because if I could do it, I would do it the minute that I wanted to do it, and I'd put it exactly where I want. Whereas once you start soliciting help, you need to be considerate of their time and availability. And if they say, what do you think about over here? You can't really say, I wasn't really asking for your opinion. I just wanted you to do my work, so that piece. And then the other thing that is occasionally a source of frustration is if somebody is limiting or patronizing to me, I know what I can and can't do. And I do realize that people are typically well-meaning, but if maybe I'm heading for a certain table at a restaurant and somebody says, hey, over here, we've got a spot for people in wheelchairs. And I'm like, well, thanks, but I don't want to sit over there. I want to sit over here near the window, and usually they're fine with that. Or getting on a shuttle van that has a lift, at an airport.
Yeah.
I would rather get on that shuttle van facing forward because I know how to do it and that works for me. But the people running it have been trained to make me turn around the other way.
Yeah.
And then I always want to say to them, I've been doing this about 40 years now. Which one of us do you think knows? But I have to return to the fact that they've been trained by somebody, and if they let me do it another way and something bad happens,
Yeah.
they're the one that's going to lose their job, not me,
Yeah. What about, let's talk a little bit about accessibility in the United States. I mean, I've lived overseas, so I've seen, major issues, but what do you see in terms of areas where we need to improve in the United States?
Yeah. That's a great question because, I became a wheelchair user in 1974. So I had 16 years of experience before ADA.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I've lived through the development of ADA and the transition, of the, the impacts that ADA has had now for 30 years. And, so for a little piece of context, I want to say sometimes I have to be careful with my friends who are maybe stronger and more vocal advocates for accessibility and disability issues, because it's a little bit too easy for me sometimes to think to myself, boy, you don't like it now. You should have been around.
Yeah.
It's so much better now, adaptive equipment and accessibility, that I don't generate the level of frustration that I think other people do.
Yeah.
So I really value the people who do that, because it takes whatever the cause is, whether it's equity issues based on, on gender or race or equity issues associated with disability. It takes, somebody that's got a little bit of a fire burning, to push things in the way that they should be pushed. So that's a bit of context. Now, returning to your original question, which is more what do we need to do now? And my answer is a little bit odd in this one as well. And I'll say that using parking as an example, okay?
Yeah.
In 74, it was difficult, to find any place and accessible buildings. Then after ADA, the graph moved upwards a little bit, and over the next 10 years or so, things got progressively better. There was more handicap parking spots, new buildings were accessible. And then we reached a point in society, and this is probably a good news thing maybe, but but to where disability was less stigmatizing. So now people who used to try and hide their disabilities acknowledge them and ask for accommodations. So, as an example, back in 1980, I had friends that were maybe single BK amputees who didn't use handicap parking because they didn't want to be labeled as
Yeah.
disability.
Yeah.
And, and maybe that's not wonderful because none of us should have to hide who we are, Um, but we've almost reached a point now, in my view, to where I think it's as hard to find parking now, accessible parking, as it used to be before we broadened the definitions of disability and were so successful in inviting people to embrace their disabilities. Um, and so I don't know what the answer is to that. Maybe we need to say there isn't really 10% of the population that has disabilities. It's really 18%, and we
Yeah.
need more spaces. Or maybe we need two types of spaces. Because I don't mind parking at the far distance in the lot. I just need a wide enough room. And so when the wide spaces are filled up by people who are walking people whose disabilities are different, I'll say, and honestly, some of them are pretty marginal, but that's a bit of a different discussion. Um, it just is tough. Last year, one time I said, I'm going to count the next 100 times that I'm looking for handicap parking and find out how many times I actually get it, excluding my own office, in places, that, like if I go to the store or a restaurant, and, um, and I succeeded 41 out of 100, so, so that tells me that we need to do something about that, whether it's redefining handicap parking, creating again 2 levels. Maybe half of them are white signs with blue, and those are not wider, but they're closer, and we can get a few more of them squeezed in, and there's only 30% of them that are the wide spots, but those are indeed reserved for people who have mobility impairments that require the use of adaptive equipment,
Yeah.
wheelchairs, walkers, and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where I think we're at a new crossroads, which I think is again is great because it's an indication that we've made a lot of progress, and now the pendulum is swinging. So I think it's time to look, you know, uh, closely at that. And you also get dynamics like, here's another one that I think is interesting. If you want to sit in a handicapped seating at University of Florida athletic events, and I'm right here in Gainesville, Florida, um, it's challenging to get those seats. And part of the reason is that their process for assigning those seats doesn't have an accountability mechanism. And I understand that because there's a large part of the disability community who considers it an insult to be questioned. Well, what is your disability? Why do you need? So all someone has to do is check the box that they have a disability. Okay, and even there's families that have had season tickets in the handicap seating area, and for so long that I'm pretty sure that whoever it was that qualified for it has passed away, or is no longer attending, and they just pass those seats along just like regular seats are. So we have to find these little middle grounds or ways to where we can um, have some level of an accountability mechanism without it being insulting or dehumanizing to persons with disabilities. And I get it, because when I was first a wheelchair user, I drove a little Jeep Wrangler, and I didn't even have a top for it. And once in a while, if I pulled into a handicap parking spot, someone would walk up to me and they would say, "Hey, dude, this is a handicap parking spot." And I just nod my head at the wheelchair in the back, and I'd say, "I have a wheelchair." And they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," and I'd say, "No big deal," and off they go. Um, but now I think people, including law enforcement, are a little bit terrified to question anybody because they're going to be ripped, you know. Uh, so some of us with disabilities probably need to accept the fact that if we really want accountability and the spaces and accommodations preserved for people who really have disabilities, we may have to trade off being occasionally questioned by
Yeah.
somebody, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I
Mm,
want to move now to wheelchair basketball and
mm,
other
mm,
adaptive sports. I've seen the movie The Rebound. I've watched Rising Phoenix.
mm,
I've recently spoken to some of our Paralympians who are playing in
mm,
Spain.
mm,
Um, so two-part question.
mm,
One, how do we get more collegiate programs that can then translate into people, athletes playing professionally in the US?
mm.
How do we, so let's take part one first, the whole collegiate issue, and
Okay.
then, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question because, because it is a challenge, and the challenge has several different dynamics in it. It's not as simple as funding. That's the first one that people think about. We need to help get funding at more institutions. Um, the other dynamic is we have to have athletes that are uh, academically inclined to go to college, athletically interested, talented, because the level of play in the intercollegiate division is high. Um, so just being in a wheelchair and going to college isn't enough to be successful at that. It's almost like the dynamic you hear about in the NFL with quarterbacks. You'll hear people say there's 32 teams, but there aren't 32 elite NFL level quarterbacks. And I don't know if that's necessarily true because, but their point is, after about 12 or 14, there's a noticeable gap to the next tier of them. So, I think we need to do everything we can to support juniors programs, and create those opportunities for younger kids with disabilities to get challenging experiences, and part of it is having opportunities available for them in college. So there's something that they are striving for. Um, I think we need also, and not everyone agrees with me on this one, but I think, we have to look at the fact that some of the athletes that are eligible may have a very minor disability, and I think we also need to look at a classification system that includes some able-bodied participation. Whether we make them 4.5s or 5.0s, but to reach the critical mass, on teams. And, we did a pilot study for about 3 years in the intercollegiate division, and we grew the division more rapidly by allowing able-bodieds to play. And we grew the number of athletes with disabilities. It wasn't simply the addition of able-bodieds. And that's because for Eastern Washington right now is an emerging program.
Yeah.
And I haven't checked with David. I don't know what they're doing in terms of using able-bodieds, but the University of Florida's club team is half of the team is able-bodied right now, and eventually, they'll reach a critical mass, and they'll attract more 1s, 1.5s, 2s, and 2.5s,
Right.
because if you have 4.5s that are able-bodied, you need more of the lower classification players. And I think this works also with the mindset that most young people have, including persons with disabilities. They would prefer to live in an inclusive society, not a segregated, protectionist type of an environment. As long as the inclusion of able-bodied athletes isn't at the expense of athletes with disabilities.
Yeah.
Most college athletes are talented enough to where they will just say, "Oh, somebody able-bodied wants to play, put them in a chair and bring it on."
Yeah.
I know it's a little different when you look at maybe some of the juniors programs that have smaller, younger kids, and um, so we have to, if we're going to allow able-bodieds anywhere other than the intercollegiate division, you know, um, then we need to look at it very carefully, and maybe a limited number in some type of a way for managing classification to ensure, that it doesn't cause, young kids with more severe disabilities to not be participating. But in the college division, we found that it's worked just making them 4.5s. In fact, I don't think we had more than one of those able-bodied players who would have been considered among the best 3 or 4 players on their own team.
Right. That's
Yeah,
right.
they played, 8 minutes a game. They helped at practice because it gave them, a good 5-on-5. I can really only, the 8 minutes were valuable minutes, and maybe they scored 6 points, 8 points. They were good players, but in 0 cases were they the best player on their team. They didn't take over the sport from persons with disabilities. So I think that's another way to help it. I think what we're doing in the NWBA now with attracting sponsorship from organizations that are not purely disability type companies. Now we have Toyota. We have Molten. Several others. They're not all wheelchair manufacturers who are wonderful sponsors. Or catheter companies. They're broader. And as we see things like that Guinness commercial, from a couple of years ago, all of those little societal things to where society acknowledges, and we acknowledge as persons with disabilities, that we are just part of the bigger tapestry of this society. We move past the, I don't want to call it patronizing because it's not quite that, but we move past a model to where we are supported because people emotionally feel sorry and want to, we reach a point to where it's attractive and intriguing to people on its own merits, and that is a safer place to be than having to rely on people to use their extra to help people that are less fortunate.
Yeah. So the second part of the question, I mean, these are definitely elite athletes. I mean, there's no doubt.
Right.
But then, so how do we move from, okay, you're playing collegiate to now here's an opportunity for you to play professionally, just like,
Right.
men and women who play college basketball, able-bodied, they go and play.
Yeah, so we have that same challenge there that we talked about, even in terms of filling intercollegiate rosters. In order for a sport to be appealing professionally, it has to attract a fan following. There has to be some mechanism there to where it generates revenue, or it's philanthropic. So for it to generate revenue, the level of the game has to stay high. So I think whatever growth we have in that area has to be managed in a way that ensures not only competitive equity, but competitive quality, so that people are actually seeing something that, and you and I have seen that, when we've watched elite. I saw Paul Schulte in a NBA all-star game, among the intercollegiate teams that played there, hit half a dozen NBA threes, in an exhibition. We've seen guys that tilt their chair onto one wheel, and we see the lower classification players who may not be as athletically amazing, but we see them hit every layup. We see them make 74% of their free throws, just like in the NBA. So the quality has to be at that level for it to happen. The difficulty for this, in part, is even if we had right now, let's say we had a 8-team professional league in the United States, and we decided tomorrow we were going to begin it. The quality spread across 8 teams, I don't know if there's 100 available gifted enough athletes today in the right classification ranges, So, so, and maybe there is, but maybe what we can, and we tried that with Division I wheelchair basketball back, from 1996 through about 2002. I think we had about maybe 5 or 6 years of that, and we fluctuated between 7 teams and 10 teams mostly, um, depending on there's more talent now. So I think we probably could field a 12-team league.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just going to have to be curated in a way that ensures competitive balance. One of our challenges when we did Division I before was, maybe I shouldn't use this as an example because the University of Alabama's NCAA football team seems to be in the league by its own self, but you have to strike that balance between appreciating, valuing, and honoring the teams that are doing it right and winning, without it getting to being a point to where other people don't even really want to play because they have no chance of winning. So what we did the last couple of years is we had a draft of the intercollegiate players, and that helped us. We distributed the talent around better that way. I was with Dallas at that point, and and we just added those last 2 years really role players, from community teams, because we had a talented starting five and we were getting the eighth pick. So it has to be well thought out and rolled out in a way that ensures that it's got some level of success from the start, because if it rolls out unsuccessfully, then you're worse off than if you hadn't tried it.
Yeah, love that. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our interview. What are some final words that you'd like to leave our listening audience with? Whether it's about adaptive sports, inclusiveness, whatever you'd like to say.
Yeah, I think I would just say that we live in the most dynamic society that we've ever lived in terms of access to information and not just the internet, but I can buy something now and it'll be on my porch online, and it's on my porch tomorrow morning, if not tonight. So we have to embrace these types of things, if we want to grow and be a part of what's next. So we have to be prepared to move with the times. And from my perspective, if that means inclusivity in terms of, of including able-bodied athletes, and see, that's the other thing that would help, that pro wheelchair basketball, we could field probably 16 teams if we were allowed to attract able-bodied, athletes as well. So we have to do those, we have to be creative and do those types of things. I'm very optimistic personally with the NWBAs. There's growing pains that come with changes in leadership and changes in philosophy. And any organization that at its core has competition is always going to have days to where people don't like a decision that was made because it doesn't benefit them directly. So we all have to look at this and say, what do we collectively need to do that's in the best interest of the growth of the sport, even if it threatens my little dynasty in some way, So I think, to the degree that our leadership can keep that mindset, and the rank and file can understand and appreciate that that's what's happening, then I think we give ourselves the best chance to grow.
Great. Doug, thanks so much. Great discussion.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.